Spider-Man does whatever Spider can. Science of web any time.
Bet you didn't expect this, did you?
No.
Spider-Man Far From Home is written by the same people who wrote Homecoming and also Ant-Man and the Wasp. I'd say Far From Home's script is a lot closer to Ant-Man and the Wasp than it is to Homecoming. While I watched it at the cinema, it was an enjoyable and entertaining movie. If that's all you need from a film, that's great. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. But the more I reflected on the film, the more I soured on the experience. Overall, I was disappointed by the film. That's not to say I didn't enjoy it, it's a case of my expectations being so much higher than what the film delivered. I had a fair amount of fun, but the aspects I was excited about from the trailers were not in the film at all. Talk about a bait and switch. I saw 2 trailers before I watched the movie. The first looked kind of lame, but the second trailer I saw introduced some elements that I was really excited about. But then I saw the movie and it had none of those exciting elements from the trailers and proceeded in exactly the way you would expect. When I left the cinema, I was happy with my experience. I didn't feel like I wasted my time, and despite the many problems of the film, I enjoyed myself. But the more I think about the film, all I can think about are those issues that prevent this movie from being great. Some of the action sequences were spectacular. I did notice a few stunts with bad wire work which I found really distracting. Of course, the special effects were fantastic. I don't remember ever having been distracted by any special effects, which is a sign they're done really well. The acting was good all around. Tom Holland fits the role of Spider-Man so perfectly. He felt so natural in the role, it's hard to imagine anyone else playing that character now. I do think Peter being poor and struggling financially was lost in this film, and I guess you could make the argument that we've seen him struggle with money and his working class background before. They did it in Homecoming, for example, but it's an element of his character that helped him feel a lot more relatable to people. It separates him from Iron Man and Thor to make him his own clear-cut character. Seeing Peter Parker play around with all these new fancy Tony Stark gadgets is fun. I believe Homecoming struck a perfect balance between the high-tech suits and the poor down-on-his-luck Peter, and unfortunately that is an element that's missing in Far From Home. Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio was solid, and Samuel Jackson is always fun. The issue I had with the film is that the script is poor and the storytelling is weak, but all the actors managed to keep me interested in enjoying what was going on. I don't really know anything about Mysterio at all. Despite having read hundreds of Spider-Man comics, I've somehow missed every issue Mysterio appears in. The only thing I've ever seen Mysterio in is one episode of the classic cartoon, which was incredibly goofy and hilarious.
What was that? Probably a sonic boom.
The thought of a character like Mysterio using illusions and tricks seemed a bit childish and stupid, but surprisingly the film made it work, for the most part. I mean, if you stop to think about how it all works, a lot of it falls apart, but it works well enough to keep you entertained. The character felt genuine, and any issues I had stem from either the script or the direction. The film has 2 major problems which both come from the script, and they feed into each other and drag the whole experience down. The first is that there's way too many jokes. If you find them funny, you probably won't find this such a problem, but I found only a handful of the jokes landed. Although the ones that did work were really funny, the issue is that there are so many jokes the film doesn't have time to breathe, and neither do I. The jokes take priority over drama, tension and character building. What were well-rounded yet humorous characters in Homecoming now have their personalities warped and bent out of shape just for the sake of a punchline. Nearly all of the secondary characters are turned into walking joke dispensers. In Homecoming, the teacher was generally quiet, but he had a few lines that were a bit awkward and funny, and they informed the audience about the type of person he is. In Far From Home, he's got verbal diarrhea. He becomes intolerable. Ned, for example, has nothing to do except spout punchlines for the whole film. The result is these people don't get the quiet character moments they need to give the audience that emotional connection. They don't feel like real people anymore. The opening scene in Far From Home shows the after effects from the devastation caused in Infinity War and Endgame, but it's treated like a joke. Sure, what they do is funny, but every reference to Thanos and that enormous event is treated like a joke and it robs them of their weight. None of the characters seem to be affected or to struggle with what happened. It basically resets the status quo to what it was before Infinity War. Besides the absence of Iron Man, the consequences of Endgame are entirely treated as a joke and may as well not have happened. I had always presumed Uncle Ben had been part of the MCU version of Spider-Man, but they didn't show it because we've already gone through it a few times with previous iterations of the character. Uncle Ben is an incredibly important part of why Peter becomes Spider-Man, so I thought in the MCU they would drop a few lines here and there throughout the movies to fill us in. It'd save the filmmakers having to drag the audience through it all over again, like how we have to watch Bruce Wayne's parents die every time there's a new Batman movie. It's important, but it also gets tiresome seeing the same thing over and over again. In Far From Home, Aunt May has a relationship with someone, which comes across to me as disrespectful to the memory of Uncle Ben, but since Uncle Ben isn't directly mentioned, he may not actually exist in the MCU, in which case it brings up a lot of questions about Spider-Man's origins. And on top of that, the whole Aunt May dating thing is just an ongoing joke anyway. You could remove it from the film and it wouldn't make a difference. It's just an example of weakening characters for the sake of a joke. The second issue is that it's a film that lacks consequences, and to discuss this I have to go into spoilers, so spoilers ahead. Skip to this timecode if you want to avoid the spoilers. Outside of the opening scene which they turn into a joke, they effectively ignore Infinity War and Endgame. Do you remember in Homecoming when Peter was desperate to keep his identity as Spider-Man from his Aunt May?
May cannot know. I cannot do that to her right now. You know? I mean, everything that's happened with her, please.
And then at the end, Aunt May finds out Peter is Spider-Man. That's a big deal, right? Nope. May doesn't care that Peter is Spider-Man and she is fully on board for some reason. She isn't remotely worried about Peter's safety at any time. She even puts the Spider-Man suit into Peter's suitcase and actually encourages Peter to go to Europe and fight people. Makes perfect sense. In Homecoming, Peter struggled with friendships because of his commitments to being Spider-Man. He lost his girlfriend because he chose to be Spider-Man and stop the Vulture. In Far From Home, Peter has no trouble balancing his friendships and his duty as Spider-Man. He leaves his friends to be Spider-Man, but it puts no real strain on any of his relationships, and he still gets the girl in the end. You know, the girl he had no interest in before, but he suddenly likes now. There's a guy called Brad that takes a photo of Peter while he's getting changed with a woman in the room and threatens to show it to MJ to try and ruin their relationship. Nothing ever comes of it at all, it's just brushed off at the end and forgotten about. Ned gets a girlfriend on the trip and at the end of the movie they break up, resetting them both to exactly where they started at the beginning of the film. The relationship is only there for an extended joke, and it was so painfully obvious they would break up at the end that it became immensely irritating to me. When these two issues of everything being a joke and a lack of consequences are combined, it weakens the film immeasurably. Little of consequence happens, and when it does, it's treated as a joke, which undermines its dramatic weight. While we're discussing the negatives, I guess it's a good time to talk about the lack of emotional engagement. In Homecoming, we get to see Peter living his day-to-day life. Not only does it inform us about his character, but we also get to see him interact with his community, and it does it in a way that made me laugh. We understand what Spider-Man is trying to protect, and that makes it all the more impactful when the bank robbers destroy the shop across the road with their super laser weapon. Spider-Man is genuinely worried about the shop owner and dives right in to save him. And saving this guy and the cat means more to the audience because we've seen them interacting with Peter before. The consequences of Spider-Man failing to save the neighbourhood feels more real. The stakes feel higher because we know who and what is at risk. In Far From Home, Peter goes on a school trip, so he doesn't have that relationship with any of the tertiary characters he saves. I'm not saying this is bad, but it's weaker than what they did in Homecoming. And you would think going to Europe would give you some nice and varied visuals, but the cinematography is so poor you don't get to see any of it. The elemental villains that show up have no connection to Spider-Man at all. We're just told they're going to destroy the world for some reason. They have no personal dispute with Spider-Man, so while there is a physical conflict, there is no emotional one. Spider-Man just turns up in Europe and fights them for a bit. Yes, I know they were really a fake out by Mysterio, but I think that's one of the reasons I found Mysterio so predictable. I'm aware Mysterio had been a villain in the comics, but as far as I knew, he might have been a good guy at some point too. And considering how the MCU has changed a number of characters, I thought it was entirely possible that Mysterio was not a villain. But when I sat down to watch the film and saw how little effort they put into the Elemental's backstory and motivations, I knew Mysterio was the villain. I mean, why bother developing them as a legitimate threat if they aren't really the bad guys? It felt so lazy. They were just placeholders until the real villain showed up. The Vulture was motivated by Tony Stark, but it was his proximity to Spider-Man that made him scary. The Vulture was operating in Spider-Man's neighbourhood, and it turned out he was the dad of Peter's girlfriend. It made him feel dangerous. There was more tension in that car scene when he works out Peter is Spider-Man than in anything in Far From Home. And despite the Vulture being motivated by Tony Stark's actions, his outlook put him in direct opposition to Spider-Man. Peter and the Vulture are two people from the same community and with similar backgrounds, but while Peter is prospering from Tony Stark's actions, the Vulture has suffered for it, and so it forces Spider-Man to make some morally difficult decisions. It sets Spider-Man and the Vulture on a collision course. Mysterio is also motivated by Tony Stark, but he has no true connection to Spider-Man. He isn't damaging Spider-Man's community. Mysterio is in Europe and has no connection to Spider-Man at all. Spider-Man just so happened to be taking a school trip in the same place at the same time. Mysterio doesn't have a relationship with any of Spider-Man's friends or family. Mysterio is fully focused on Tony Stark and Spider-Man just gets in the way. They have no emotional connection. Again, I'm not saying it was bad, but noticeably weaker than Homecoming. The problem I had with Mysterio was that I saw through all of his illusions, which is not so much a problem with the character but more a problem with the filmmaking. Some of those illusions did look absolutely fantastic though. It was really obvious to me when Spider-Man was in an illusion set up by Mysterio and when he was in the real world, and because it was so obvious to me, it only made the characters look stupid when they didn't figure it out. I'm just too intelligent, that's my problem. Like when Peter and Mysterio were sitting in the bar talking, I knew something was off immediately. Like no one thought it was odd having these guys sit there in those weird costumes. All the people in the background didn't seem to say anything, and when Peter handed over those high-tech glasses for Mysterio to try on, I noticed he kept them on longer than would have been natural, so he clearly wanted to keep them. If you were just trying them on, you would put them on, look around, and then take them off, but Mysterio kept them on for so long I knew something was up. It's a well-made scene, but putting in all those clues kind of ruin it for people like me who are paying attention. And as soon as Peter leaves, Mysterio stands up on the bar and gives a speech about his evil plan that dragged on for about 10 minutes. He's basically a bad version of Syndrome from The Incredibles.
You sly dog! You got me monologuing!
That evil monologue was a complete misfire. That scene was terrible. As a character, I did like Mysterio. His design was good and the actor did a great job bringing him to life. But his motivation was weak and the conflicts with Spider-Man felt more incidental than two clashing points of view. Nick Fury and Maria Hill were acting kind of off for the whole film. Some of their lines were very odd and they just didn't feel right. I still enjoyed them though. Samuel L. Jackson had one of my favourite lines from the entire film.
Bitch, please, you've been to space.
Still, those two characters seemed off, but I just put it down to bad writing. The other characters have been turned into joke dispensers, so why would I expect these two to come out unharmed? But in the after credit scene, we see that Nick Fury and Maria Hill were actually the shape-shifting Skrulls. It was an interesting twist. I'm not entirely sold on it, but it could go in a very intriguing direction. Still, it can explain away a lot of the weird Nick Fury actions in the film, although I have to ask, what was with the line, "Don't invoke her name" when Peter mentions Captain Marvel?
I need an Avenger.
What about Thor?
Off-world.
Doctor Strange? Unavailable. Captain Marvel?
Don't invoke her name.
So Nick Fury is really the Skrull leader and he is on good terms with Captain Marvel, so why would he tell Peter not to invoke her name? I don't get it. Does he mean don't speak of her out of respect? If you understood it, please leave a comment below and let me know because I have no idea. The mid-credit scene was fantastic. I loved how MJ was screaming the entire time she was swinging around with Spider-Man. It was unexpected and really funny. That was good enough for me, but then J.K. Simmons shows up as J. Jonah Jameson.
I need photos! Photos of Spider-Man!
So yes, despite all my complaining, I did enjoy Far From Home. I watched Homecoming beforehand and I honestly think it's better than a lot of people remember it as being, and I'd recommend revisiting it. Out of the two films, I think Homecoming is by far superior. Far From Home had all the flaws of Homecoming and even more besides. It didn't elevate anything or improve any elements from its predecessor. When I came out of the film, I was happy enough and I would rate it a 6 out of 10. But now I've had time to think about it, I'm leaning more towards a 5 out of 10. I thought the film was fine. It was fine, but I could be wrong.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
It does seem everyone loves this movie though. I've seen no end of 10 out of 10 scores, so by all means leave a comment telling me how wrong I am. I thought the film was more or less mediocre. I doubt I'll ever watch it again, but I did get excited for where they'll take Spider-Man in the future. Well, except the contract with Disney Marvel borrowing the rights of Spider-Man from Sony is now up, so either they'll have to renegotiate to extend that deal, or Sony will pull Spider-Man from the MCU and stick him in their awful Venom universe. So currently, there's a very real chance we won't see Spider-Man in the MCU anymore. Ugh, that's kinda scary. Sony doesn't have the best track record. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for future content. It really helps out the channel. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you next time.
It defines who I am.
We're not saying you have... What?